The most well-known argument for the existence of a substantive self is found in René Descartes' Discourse on Method and his Meditations on First Philosophy. After considering the most radical form of skepticism, according to which he can know absolutely nothing at all, Descartes declared, "Cogito ergo sum." You probably know this statement better by its English translation, "I think, therefore I am." In full, the passage reads, "But immediately upon this, I observed that, whilst I thus wished to think that all was false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be something. And as I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and of such evidence that no ground of doubt, however extravagant, could be alleged by the skeptics capable of shaking it, I concluded that I might, without scruple, accept it as the first principle of the philosophy of which I was in search." Despite the most intense doubts, Descartes finds that he cannot doubt that he is doubting, and since doubting is a type of thinking, Descartes concludes that he is a thinker, and in order to be a thinker, he must exist. Hence, because he thinks, he therefore exists. This declaration, "I think, therefore I am," has earned the label the cogito in contemporary philosophy. This sort of argument for the self is not, of course, unique to Descartes. Similar arguments can be found in the writings of Aristotle, St. Augustine, and John Locke. But it is safe to say that Descartes' iteration is, by far, the most influential and most well-known. This is at least partially due to the central role which the cogito plays in Descartes' overall philosophy. As Thomas Vinci explains, Descartes treats the cogito as holding a very special place in the development of his doctrine of method. Before Descartes begins meditation 2, he is adrift on a sea of hyperbolic doubt. By the time he is finished, Descartes is about to proclaim the rule of truth and implicitly the whole of the three-step method of clear and distinct ideas. The means by which Descartes accomplishes this impressive task is the existence of a paradigm of that method in the case of first-person knowledge, the cogito. Descartes' dictum, as influential as it is, has become the whipping boy of endless criticisms in contemporary philosophy. Objections range from the idea that one cannot infer a thinker from the presence of thinking, to that the argument is patently circular, either because the I is presupposed in the first premise, or because of the so-called Cartesian circle. George Lichtenberg and Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, both offered similar objections to Descartes, according to which the cogito merely establishes that thinking is occurring, as opposed to that there is an I who is doing the thinking. Soren Kierkegaard and Bertrand Russell both objected that the cogito was patently circular. Kiarina Kordela sums up the attitude of skeptical philosophers towards the cogito rather well, saying, "If the Cartesian cogito can justly be regarded as a hallmark in the history of thought, it is actually because of the simultaneous critique and legitimization of its logical inconsistencies or circularity. Spinoza revealed the leap from thought to existence in Descartes' cogito by declaring that the 'I think, therefore I am,' far from being a syllogism, is a single proposition which is equivalent to this, 'I am thinking.' In other words, the purported syllogism is a tautology." We have, then, two basic objections to Descartes' cogito argument for the self. First, there is a question regarding how one can infer an I from the existence of thinking or of thoughts. Second, we have a charge of begging the question or of circular reasoning. Let's consider each of these in turn. The first objection seems relatively easy to meet. If thinking is going on, then surely there must be someone or something doing the thinking. There can no more be thinking without a thinker than there can be running without a runner or jumping without a jumper. An I can simply be a label for whatever that someone or something that is doing the thinking is. As Andrew Brenner explains, The basic thought is this: something thinks my thoughts. In order to avoid assuming at the outset that I exist, we should specify that the phrase my thoughts does not simply mean thoughts had by me, but rather means something like the thoughts which are such that, absent a commitment to the non-self thesis, we are normally inclined to think are thought by me. But if someone thinks my thoughts, then I am that thing. And if I think my thoughts, then I exist. Proponents of this first objection to the cogito seem to think that the existence of thoughts, or the presence of thinking, is more immediately known than the existence of the self, and that the self is somehow being inferred from the existence of thoughts. But as David Lund argues, this appears entirely backwards. The reductionist would have us believe that the expression, there is thinking, is the one rooted in the phenomenology, and that I think is not. But isn't it the other way around? When we acknowledge that any thinking is done in a first-person manner, whatever the thought may be about, then there is thinking appears to be what is derived, not in the sense that the concept of the first person is logically or temporally prior to the concept of another, but in the sense that both concepts are grounded in a reality that is originally manifested in a first-person mode. For the truth seems to be that the indubitable presence of experience of any kind requires a first-person perspective that cannot be described in third-personal or impersonal terms, and that the impersonal expression, there is thinking, is parasitic upon a reality encountered in a first-person manner and referenced by the first-person expression. Thus, any putative phenomenology of experience that leaves out its first-person character, namely the kind of phenomenology required for the truth of reductionism, seems doomed to fail. And this line of thought leads us rather naturally to the second objection to the cogito. What about the charge of circularity? It is safe to say that this is probably the most popular and most serious objection to Descartes' cogito argument, but there are actually two different ways of developing it. There is the appeal to the Cartesian circle, and then there is a more basic objection that the form of the argument is just straightforwardly question-begging. Let us consider both of these objections to see if the cogito can be vindicated from the charge of circularity. Understanding the first objection requires a little background understanding of Descartes' writings. But to put it as briefly as possible, Descartes takes the cogito to be true because it is a clear and distinct idea. However, when considering whether or not clear and distinct ideas are really true, Descartes appeals to God's existence and the fact that God couldn't possibly be a deceiver to justify his belief that clear and distinct ideas must be true. But then when it comes to the question of how Descartes knows that a non-deceiving God exists, he makes his case by appealing to clear and distinct ideas. Hence there is a circularity problem for Descartes. In order to know that clear and distinct ideas are true, he has to know that God exists. But in order to know that God exists, he has to know that clear and distinct ideas are true. This is the essence of what has been called the Cartesian circle. Stephen Wagner sums it up well. In Meditation 3, after raising doubt about the truth of his clear and distinct perceptions, Descartes tells us that he will establish their truth by proving that God exists and is not a deceiver. Within this attempt, the problem of the Cartesian circle poses three challenges. First, Descartes' proof will involve circular reasoning if it is a deductive demonstration that assumes the truth of the clear and distinct perceptions he uses as premises. Nor can Descartes assume the truth of any clearly and distinctly perceived steps of logical inference in his deductive proof. Second, Descartes' argument will be circular if he establishes his conclusion by simply achieving a clear and distinct perception of God's existence. These challenges show decisively that the strong validation project must involve circular reasoning if Descartes attempts to prove God's existence through a deductive demonstration that relies on the truth of his clear and distinct perceptions. It is my opinion that this objection to the cogito simply fundamentally misunderstands Descartes. As I read Descartes, he intends for his proof of God's existence to justify the idea that his sensory inputs are not systematically misleading. However, he does not intend for God's existence to validate clear and distinct ideas. Rather, for Descartes, it is actually the clarity itself and the distinctness itself which validates the truth of the thoughts which they accompany. As Mark Robert Burgess puts it, for Descartes, there is an element in man's epistemological makeup which is fully autonomous. That is, an element which does not require the existence of a non-deceiving God to guarantee the certainty of its truth claims. There is an element that survives the doubt introduced by the evil demon. The problem of the Cartesian circle can only be properly understood by close attention to Descartes' discussion of it in his replies to this specific objection. When we consider these replies, we find that he is surprised that his critics think that God is required to guarantee clear and distinct ideas as presently conceived, whereas his point was that the existence of a beneficent God is only required to guarantee the legitimacy of reasoning from clear and distinct ideas not presently conceived, but retained in memory as having been previously conceived. In addition, memory has no impute to the proof of God's existence. In conclusion, Descartes' mature position, in contrast to the so-called aberrant view, avoids the Cartesian circle objection. Axiomatic intuition and deductive intuition, which supply clear and distinct ideas, are autonomous and outside the influence of the malicious demon. The Cartesian circle is squared. The cogito, therefore, functions as a truly autonomous foundation within Descartes' thought. It does not depend upon a prior demonstration of the existence of God. There simply is no Cartesian circle. It goes far beyond the purposes of this video to wade into the vast sea of literature surrounding Descartes and to defend this reading of him as being the true reading of Descartes. Nor is it my purpose to comment on the success of Descartes' argument for God's existence. For our purposes in this video, it suffices to point out that my interpretation of Descartes is, at the very least, a way of construing the cogito in a way which both establishes the existence of a substantive self and evades the Cartesian circle objection, regardless of whether or not this is what Descartes actually intended. But what about the more general objection that the form of Descartes' argument is patently question-begging by presupposing the existence of the I within the first premise? Margaret Wilson explains the objection this way. The objection will now go as follows. If I think is true only if I exist is true, then to know that I think is true and certain, one must already know that I exist is true and certain. But this objection to the cogito assumes that Descartes intends for the cogito to be understood as a deductive syllogism, where I think functions as a premise and I am functions as a deductively inferred conclusion. But is that the case? It is my opinion that Descartes is best understood as drawing our attention to the fact that we know our own existence directly and non-inferentially by direct acquaintance with the simple fact of the matter that we exist. The cogito is best understood as a dialectical way of drawing one's attention to this fact. I think that it is a significant mistake to interpret the cogito as an attempt to make a syllogistic argument for the existence of oneself, where the premise is known independently of the conclusion. Rickabaugh and Moreland explain the basic idea this way. Applied to self-knowledge, in reflection, I apprehend myself intuitively and originally. Myself and its states or qualities are given to me in the strictest and most adequate possible way. They are known by acquaintance. when I think of or reflect on those states, I undergo a case of fulfillment. I come to know that I am a simple, immaterial substance among many other things. Jerrold Katz is a scholar who defends this general sort of interpretation of Descartes. He defends the cogito as being best understood as an analytic truth, that is, a truth which holds in virtue of the very meanings of the constituent terms. As he explains, all the parts of my argument that the cogito is an analytic entailment are now in place. At the outset, I claimed that once scholarship no longer has to treat the cogito within the standard conception of inference, the difficulties that beset attempts to elucidate it disappear. I claimed that the principal difficulty is the Cartesian scholar's dilemma. The Cartesian scholar seems forced to say either that Descartes gave a palpably fallacious argument or that he couldn't manage to give the right one. Either way, Descartes is portrayed as blundering in an argument of such simplicity that it is child's play to see the fallacy or express the right argument. The dilemma disappears once, 1. The standard conception is replaced by a conception on which some inferences presented in the form P therefore Q are valid as they stand, and 2. It is shown that I think therefore I exist is such an inference. The fact that the connection between I think and I exist cannot be sanctioned as an instance of a logical law no longer puts the Cartesian scholar in the dilemma, since the connection can be shown to be truth-preserving on the basis of semantic representations which expose the decompositional structure of the sentences. Such semantic representations show that the proposition expressed by I exist is a component of the proposition expressed by I think, so that the former must be true whenever the latter is true. The portrait of Descartes that emerges is far more appropriate. And Descartes' own writings support this general interpretation, as he himself suggests that he did not understand or intend the cogito as a formal argument for his own existence. As he writes, when we observe that we are thinking beings, this is a sort of primary notion which is not the conclusion of any syllogism, and, moreover, when somebody says, I am thinking, therefore I am or exist, he is not using a syllogism to deduce his existence from his thought, but recognizing this as something self-evident in a simple mental intuition. Importantly for our purposes here, if the cogito is best construed as an analytically true proposition, which is intended to direct one's attention to their own direct acquaintance with themselves, there is no circularity involved in Descartes' cogito argument for the self. This is because the cogito is not, in fact, an argument at all in the traditional syllogistic sense. It is more of a dialectical move intended to sharpen one's pre-existing implicit awareness of themselves. As Katz concludes, this objection does not go through because the definition of vicious circularity as analytic entailment is unacceptable. What is wrong with the definition is that it makes question begging exclusively a matter of grammatical structure, whereas the sin in begging the question is that the point at issue in the controversy is taken for granted, and it is typically an extra-grammatical matter what point is at issue. The definition of circular reasoning as an analytic entailment misses the essential relativization of question begging to the question at issue. Once this definition is rejected, there is no longer grounds for arguing that the cogito is a circular argument just because it is an analytic entailment. If this understanding of Descartes is right, then we have exonerated Descartes of the charge of circularity.